Bell End, Minge Lane, 69, Willie. Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Welcome to part 2 of our Grand Tour or road trip where we're visiting several places across the country that have some rather offensive or silly place names. In the last video we ended in Willie, which is found to the north of Rugby in Warwickshire. Our tour today takes us into Leicestershire and 55 miles from Willie to our next destination. However, where I am now isn't the location that we're looking for. I've made a little bit of a stop to look at something that I thought was quite interesting. Although it's fair to say I might regret making this little stop and detour. We should have just cracked on, really, because look at the state of this. In part 1 we ended with some railway content, so I thought for part 2 we could start with some railway content. I'll keep it brief and try not to bore you too much. On the way to our next destination we passed Old Dalby, where we find the Old Dalby test track. In 1984 the track was used to test the integrity of flasks that were used to transport nuclear fuel elements, creating possibly some of the most famous railway footage ever. In simple terms, they crashed a train into one of these flasks just to see what would happen. Leaving Leicestershire behind, we head into Lincolnshire where we find our next stop. Welcome to Bitchfield. Bitchfield village is sort of made up of two halves. You've got the main Bitchfield and then lower Bitchfield, which is accessed via Dark Lane, like a couple of bitches. Bitchfield can trace its roots as far back as the medieval times, and to the south of Bitchfield is what's known as the Campfield Earthworks. At first glance it's just a patch of land, but this land is not naturally formed, which suggests a settlement here, most likely dating back to the medieval era. If that's the case, and it seems very likely that it is, Bitchfield would have once been a much larger village that over the years has reduced in size. Apparently there's a storm coming today. 45-mile-an-hour gusts. Before we head off to our next destination, I wanted to make a quick detour because a few miles to the east of Bitchfield is the former RAF Fokingham. During World War II, Lincolnshire was littered with airfields totalling around 50 across the county, but I think the history of RAF Fokingham is a little bit more interesting post-war. During the late 40s, early 50s, a company called British Racing Motors, or BRM, would use the runway for vehicle and engine testing. Their first engine was to be used in F1, and it was a 1.5-litre supercharged V16 engine capable of producing 600 horsepower at 12,000 RPM. And whilst that sounds absolutely insane, and it is, it proved to be somewhat unreliable and was withdrawn in 1952. BRM would be kicked out of Fokingham in the late 1950s by the RAF and the United States Air Force, who wanted to use the sites for their Thor missile systems. These were rather large missiles that were mostly targeted on Russia during the Cold War era, and across the country you'd have found around 60 of these missile sites ready to go at short notice. And indeed, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, nearly every single Thor missile was placed on a 15-minute readiness schedule should they be required. Fortunately, they weren't required, and a few years later the Thor missile systems were all withdrawn. Today the launch sites remain in situ because it's not economically viable to demolish and remove what's left of them. Right, I'm back in the car for the final leg of the tour, if you will. It's the longest at 95 miles and we're heading up north. To get there I'm going to use the A15, which is arguably the UK's longest, straightest road. Sadly, it's got speed cameras along its length. The A15 eventually reaches the M180 motorway, at which point we need to take a right turn to continue our journey. However, before we do that, we're going to head left, which will take us into Scunthorpe, the only town with in the name. It's famous for its steelworks and industrial areas, and it's also home of the A1077M, a stupid waste of a motorway. To cross into Yorkshire, we need to use the Humber Bridge, a bridge that goes over the Humber. It opened in 1981, and at the time it was the longest bridge of its type at 1.38 miles, a record that it held until 1998. To construct it, the road decks were brought in on barges and then hoisted into position via cables. Unfortunately, they dropped one of the road decks during construction when the cables snapped, but no bother, they just brushed it off and fitted it into position anyway. I'm sure it's fine. 20 or so miles later and we arrive at the last destination of our tour, Wetwang. One of the first things you see as you drive into Wetwang is the Wetwang Communal Holy Pond. Today, just a pond, but back in the old days it served a very different purpose. The local tradition in the area was to arrive at the village and dip your gentleman's sausage in the pond, thus washing and cleansing you of any evil spirits that you might be bringing into the village. Of course, with no central heating, it took a while before you'd dry off, meaning you'd spend half a day walking around with a Wetwang, and that's where the village gets its name. On the north side of the village, we find the Wetwang Community Playground. Shocking. Well, thanks for coming along on this grand tour of stupid place names. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is of course a button specifically for that. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That would be wicked sweet awesome. All going to plan, I would have uploaded this video on New Year's Eve 2023. So I hope you have a fantastic New Year's. All the best for 2024. And thank you guys so much for your support throughout 2023. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys next year. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.